What was shaping up was a battle of the big names in their Mustangs. However, in the following year, it didn't quite work out that way. Bob Jane's car went out of contention after it was destroyed in a spectacular crash at Catalina Park in New South Wales.
So I was coming through the corner there, and all of a sudden the car let go and it rolled extensively, ended up over the fence, up on the right side up, with a windshield broken and a 45 DCO Weebus on my lap on fire, and I threw it out the window. And my first recollection was Ian Gagan saying, "You're all right, mate," and which I was. All I did was bump my elbow, because in those days we didn't have the net at the window, and as it rolled, I kept hitting my elbow on the ground, and it was a pretty hairy accident. And I'll never forget, on Monday morning I picked up the Mirror from the doorstep, and there's the front page. And actually, it's a funny story there, if it's worth relating. The guy, an amateur, took the photograph, sold to the Mirror, and got a job there as a result of getting that photo. And was still, I talked to him at Bathurst about 2005, and he told me the story that he took the photo, got the front page, and got a job there for life.
1966 saw one of Australian touring car racing's great showdowns between two drivers who had become the giants of domestic motorsport. The scene was the Australian Touring Car Championship at Bathurst, and Norm Beechey, who had turned up with two cars, his Mustang and a new Chevrolet, decided at the last minute to use the Chev to battle Gagan's Mustang.
That was a great contest. Mount Panorama, fantastic circuit. Pete Gagan in the 65 Mustang and Norm Beechey in the new Chevy Nova. It was called the Chevy 2 at the time, but became known as the Chevy Nova. A more powerful car, bigger capacity engine than Pete's Mustang, but still a little bit of an untried machine, because it was quite early in its racing life. So it was quite an interesting situation. And absorbing battle, I think it was a 40-lap race, and Beechey won the start and pulled away from Gagan and was maintaining quite a strong position there, but in that typical Pete Gagan style, he just started to reel him in and reel him in and reel him in and reel him in, and he eventually got him. It was an absorbing contest. It was really exciting.
It was a one-race event in those days, and that was between, effectively it was between Norm Beechey and the Chevy Nova and Pete Gagan and the Mustang, and Norm had just sort of toddled off into the distance and held about a 10-second lead on Pete, and that looked like it was going to be just the whole race. And then things didn't go quite well for the Nova. It started to slow down a little bit, either that or Pete speeded up a bit. I was standing at McPhillamy Park corner watching this, and Pete kept getting closer and closer, and then they came over the hump into McPhillamy Park corner. I don't know, it was halfway through the race roughly. Pete was right on the Nova's tail. And what did he do? He literally took one pace to the right and drove round the outside of Norm through the corner. And everybody just stopped. There was silence as we watched it happen. I mean, you don't see that happen very often at that speed.
Back in those days, they really were larger than life. Everyone wanted their heroes, and they were the heroes, certainly, of touring car racing in the 1960s. Great showmen, both of them. Beechey, very flamboyant, very exciting driving style behind the wheel. Pete Gagan's driving just superb, and they really were great characters.
They were bigger than Ben-Hur. I mean, Norm used to buy tyres not so much for how well they stuck to the road as to how much smoke they would generate. And at the end of race meetings, he would sit on the roof of the car and people would surround the car. I mean, he was a rock star in his own way. And Pete Gagan was just the most amazing character. He had a speech impediment, most people know that, so he wasn't a great conversationalist in public, but he did it all on the racetrack. He didn't need to do anything else except drive those cars absolutely to the limit. And when you see film of Pete coming off the causeway at Warwick Farm, which is a fairly tight series of left-hand hooks, and he would go through there almost entirely the whole distance on right-hand lock. The car was literally on opposite lock for the entire distance of the corner. And he would do it lap after lap. That wasn't a fluke, it was just the way he drove the corner.
Car number 1, the Ford Mustang, driven by Leo Gagan. In second place, following Jim McEwen in the Ladies Sport 14. Ian Gagan driving, not Leo Gagan. Leo qualified in the car, but Ian Gagan at the wheel of the Ford Mustang.
And quite a handle it is indeed. As you can see, coming on the crossing, it's diving off the side of the road. But as he's commonly called, Pete Gagan there, out in with he still leads.
Motor racing was fun then, you know, and it's still fun now, but it's much more commercial. I can remember standing in the pits at Catalina Park, Katoomba, and Leo was coming out. It'd been a wet day of practice and qualifying on Saturday, and of all categories, sports cars, single-seaters, touring cars and everything, Frank Matic was the fastest guy in a sports car round this tight, treacherous track. Not a run-off point anywhere on the track. You were going to hit a wooden fence, a railway sleeper, if you got wide anywhere. And it dipped and it dived and it went round, you know, the tunnel of love, and it was a tunnel, and so on. And Frank Matic was the fastest guy in this rain-sodden, foggy day on the Saturday. Pete Gagan was the second fastest in the Mustang, of all cars. The next day, they're standing around in the pits, you see, and Leo's coming up in this little pucker thoroughbred, you know, arm's length, in the Lotus single-seater and everything. And Pete's there and he says, stand back, fellas. Here come the speed cars, he said. He said, poor old bloke, slower than the Stang yesterday. Oh, look, everybody's got stories about Pete rescuing unbelievable situations in the Mustang, and I saw him rescue one at Catalina Park, but I saw him with others at Sandown and Warwick Farm and places. He was just a guy that loved having fun, you know. Those days, the pits would open up after the meeting and people would pull through and they'd look under cars. Didn't know what they were looking for or anything, you know. And this occasion, the Gagans were running about 4 cars for Pete and Leo. And people looking under the Mustang, and you can see everybody sort of bouncing a little bit and coming away smiling. And somebody written in chalk across the differential, "Piss off, nosy."
Norm Beachy and I were always good mates in the early days. We spent before we went racing, we were mates, and Norm and I had clashes at Sandown and Jagger versus his Impala, and my mother used to cry because the newspapers used to write about Bob and Norm's clash at Sandown this weekend, or was colder. They say, "Mum, he's my mate." We did hit each other occasionally. We had days like Norm Beachy put a tow bar on the back of his race car because I kept hitting him up the arse under brakes. And they said, "What are you going to do, Bob?" And I said, "I bought 3 grills. So I'm going to punch his bloody tow bar off the planet." At Sandown, you see. But really, it was, even though we were competitive, we will never hurt each other. And the same with Ian Gagan. I mean, Ian, I remember racing when we first went to New South Wales when Warwick Farm opened. There was a big rivalry between, and was there for years, between Victorian drivers and the New South Wales Gagans and this one and that one. But we broke that down fairly easily. I mean, I remember going to Ian's wedding, Ian Gagan's wedding to Nan, and fond memories of my relationship with him. But the competitive on the track was different. In your heart, you had a good feeling about these people, you know?
Well, I give those guys an A for courage. driving those cars because, as you say, they didn't have anything like the modern systems that they got now. They were, by comparison to today's cars, quite agricultural, quite primitive. But this was the era of the seat of the pants driver. You know, now they've got all this onboard data acquisition and data logging systems where they'll go and do some few laps, they'll download the computer and they'll analyse every little component of the car. Back then you didn't have that. You just had a few analogue gauges on the dashboard, and it was just through the seat of the pants feel and courage and bravado that made the difference.
Throughout this time, Pete was to be practically unstoppable in his 1965 Mustang. As well as the National Championship, he won the New South Wales, Victorian, South Australian and Queensland titles. He was the holder of the lap record at every circuit he competed on.
Just extraordinary. 68 wins from 74 starts, ended up in the Guinness Book of Records, and I think it still stands today.
So why was he so dominant? Was it just because of his talent? Because there were other Mustangs competing too, weren't there?
Oh, sure. I think it was a combination of, as we've discussed before, there's a number of elements that make a winning car. And I think the fact that John Shepherd built the car properly in the first place, his maintenance was second to none. And of course you had Pete Gagan's brilliance behind the wheel. I mean, Leo Gagan, even Pete's brother Leo, said, I really felt sorry for guys like Bob Jane and Norm Beachy having to come out and face Pete Gagan every few weeks because he was just unbelievable.